So let me start. Thank you for waiting. My name is Fujimura. What David just talked about was very inspiring. And what I'm doing is from a different perspective, but I'd like to show you some of my projects. New Metabolism for Tokyo is the title of my presentation. New Metabolism is the theme of this session. So I'd like to share with you what my interpretation is of that terminology, New Metabolism. As architect, I am doing my job. And just like looking at models, I am having a bird's eye view as I do the architecture. We have been talking about biology, living organisms, and I am attempting to grow and nurture architecture as we nurture and grow living organisms. So I am designing so that things will grow. And this is another project, small volume, growing, and forming a bigger system. So this is a pursuit of what it is that humans design. The process of fish getting life and growing is the analogy that I have in mind. As you can see, starting from the upper left-hand corner all the way to this difficult hole in the lower right-hand side, as Robert Benjamin said. So how do you create this whole process is what I'm trying to do in my architectural endeavor. So this is each stage being represented by different models. Resolve one issue per stage. The iteration of that is what I'm trying to do. This is the whole process, about 40 generations altogether, building into something big in stages. So how does this relate to urban context? And I think that is where new metabolism comes in. So what is happening in Japan? I'd like to talk about that very briefly from the urban development point of view. Aging infrastructure, the rotting infrastructure is what people are concerned about. Back in 2012, there was an accident of the ceiling of the tunnel on an expressway falling, and this is another example. And in Minato Ward as well, the public highway caved in. So we are seeing a series of infrastructure collapsing, and this is what's called the collapsing or decaying infrastructure. This is the issue that is facing Tokyo. Back in the U.S., this happened back in 1980s because many of the infrastructures were built in the 1930s. In Japan, a similar concentrated infrastructure investment was made in 1960s, 30 years after that in the U.S. And therefore, what happened in the U.S. in 1980s is exactly what's happening in Japan this decade. We are seeing many issues associated with the aging and collapsing and decaying of infrastructure during this decade. And in addition, Japan is faced with this issue of aging of society. In the U.S., in the suburbs of Detroit, we see the collapse and decaying, the devastation of cities. And at the same time, in New York, we see the rebirth of the city as well. So we're faced with this question, which way is Tokyo going? Detroit and New York. Within this context, what is metabolism going to offer to us? Is the question. And I'd like to think about the issues of urban design from the perspective of shrinking the city. What do I mean by shrinking? Back in 1961, Kenzo Tange's office presented this plan, the Tokyo Plan 1960. Back then, the issue was the increased density, the overcrowding. So he proposed that the linear developments be pursued instead of the radial one. Whereas what's happening in Tokyo today is on the suburbs of Tokyo, we do see the aging of infrastructure, aging of society, as well as hollowing out. And part of that is being addressed in my personal project in Tsurugashima in Saitama Prefecture. Tsurugashima was developed back in the 1960s as the bed town of Tokyo. This red area is about 20 minutes walk from a train station. Many of the residential buildings were built, as well as universities and others. Elementary schools and community centers were built very rapidly during that time, and these buildings are faced with the aging issues. So how are we to address this? Of course, we have to keep in mind that financial aspect is very gloomy. On the left-hand side, you can see the public building construction expenses. This is a public expenditure. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Social Security expenses. Back in the 1990s, the amount was 4 billion versus 0.6 billion, whereas in 2004, they became on the par, 1.9 billion each, and in 2011, the order was reversed. The public buildings expenditure was 1.2, whereas Social Security expenses increased to 3.9 billion. In other words, Social Security for long-term care, medical care, these expenses are far greater than the public building construction-related expenses today. So in Tsurugashima today, it is almost impossible to build new public buildings. They can only renovate and repair should there be a leak, for instance. So that's one of the issues faced in Tokyo today. And what we did in our project was how to globally reduce the amount of infrastructure in a collective manner. And we have plotted the public buildings in Tsurugashima. In certain sections, we will be scrapping or we'll be closing the schools, public schools, and in others we'll renovate them. And here you can see the ages of different buildings. Older ones 40, 50 years, younger ones about 20 years old. And the durability of concrete is taken into consideration, and we had to ask ourselves, which one are we going to scrap, which one we are going to renovate or replace. So buildings are not forever. There are physical limits and physical durability. And that is the physical condition that binds the Japanese cities today. But, of course, for the consolidation or scrapping of these public buildings, these will entail political conflict of interest. 1/3 of the floor space could be maintained. Only 1/3 of the roads could be maintained, according to the calculations based on the available fund in Tsurugashima. So what are we going to do? By 2019, the renovation peak is going to arrive. And so it was imminent that they addressed this. This was a big political issue in the coming 5-10 years. So we have a studio in our university, Toyo University, and students were asked to make proposals with this shrinking, the need for shrinkage in mind.
方向性を選択してもらおうというような
And we have been looking at the directions to pursue. This is what is referred to as a public meeting. And here we get the community people together to ask for their feedback and to exchange opinions. And actual models of the buildings are made. And like seeds, they're placed. A simple model is made, and the votes are taken. And after 2 weeks, we bring some more. So step by step, we try to get a consensus, and we try to look at what the shape of the infrastructure should be like. Those are a series of workshops. Gradually, it became more complete. And so when rebuilding, the shape of the facilities were considered. By repeating this process, gradually, consensus among the citizens and understanding of the citizens can be obtained. Before voting, the residents confirm with the designers about the intentions of the design. Then a referendum is made, and based on the voting results, the options are narrowed down. Benjamin Sun's presentation talked about the use of interalgorithms to generate architecture and then to use an evaluation algorithm. That process was introduced. Likewise, here we have a very biological process of generation and elimination to narrow down the options. After that, when the design of the architectural facilities were carried out, there were workshops and there were 10 options that were generated. Based on that, we went through a process of voting so that we could narrow down the choices. Ultimately, going through a series of studies, there's a consolidation into a single proposal, and then the actual building took place. This is the construction site. And as we try to shrink down into suburban areas for public buildings, concrete buildings will be consolidated into a few locations, whereas within the community, there are going to be smaller wooden structure buildings that will be spread around. That's the thinking of this. And as for those facilities, it will not be left up to the administration, but it would be managed by the community. In regard to the reality that surrounds us, how does new metabolism get involved? The following is my proposal in this regard. If you look at the capsule tower of Kurokawa, this was created in 1972. And among the buildings that were made around this time, these are being rebuilt or renovated. And a lot of decisions have to be made now about this. For example, the Wangan Tower condominiums will have to be refurbished or will have to be rebuilt. So how should we perceive this? What we must remember is that among the metabolist proposals for scaling up, there are ideas, but there's also various proposals for scaling down. This is the Sky House work of Norio Kikutake, and inside there are children's rooms that were planned, and they are referred to as move nets. Children's rooms hung from above. And as Kikutake-san's children grew up, these move nets were removed. So it's not just the scaling up, but also, depending on the changes, it's necessary to be able to scale down. And so this kind of a metabolism concept was applied. It's possible to interpret the approach this way. So when we talk about the new metabolism, one thing that we have to think about is that there's the extension of the metabolism of the 1960s and look at it as aging metabolism. So we should look at this as a continuity of metabolisms. And when it comes to an aging metabolism, for example, there's the Nakagin capsule tower. Instead of regarding this as a failure to realize a capsule, depending on how the consensus is achieved, it may be possible that the replacement of capsules can be carried out. And so the time has come whereby it's necessary to debate about what to do about these buildings. It would be more appropriate that way. It could be that the good points of a capsule can be used to continue to make them last, or in the center of Tokyo, it could well be that we're seeing an aging population and a declining population throughout Japan, but in the center of Japan, in Tokyo, we need more floor space. And so therefore, it doesn't mean that Japan is scaling down uniformly. We must look at the fact that there are some areas where there is still scaling up. And there's a plan for Tokyo by Kenzo Tange, and this can be considered as the vertebrae and the nerves, and we can look at the branches. That was the analogy that was used, but this concept is still valid. It's not an old concept, but rather it is best to consider that these ideas are still valid in an aging metabolism. Consequently, I believe that when it comes to the Tokyo metabolism, when a new metabolism concept is to be considered within Tokyo, Tange-san and Kurokawa-san's concepts can once again be applied to this era to create new activities by people. And I'm thinking about how to go about this. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation regarding my thoughts on the new metabolism for Tokyo.